Hi everyone, Molton here and welcome back to my recap of the World Championship games round 1 and 2 and what a match we've had so far. We've had some very interesting and fresh ideas brought onto the table by both sides and both very interesting openings which led to draws, but very fighting draws and nothing we can really complain about from a spectator point of view. What's most surprising that I've been very impressed by especially Nepo's ability to handle the pressure situations, especially in the second game where he was under significant pressure from Magnus's very good preparation. So the first game started with 1e4, e5. I won't spend too much time in the first game because I want to move on to the second one, which I believe was more interesting. But knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, Ruy Lopez, which is a very common in World Championship matches. And usually the first few games sets up the tone of what we can expect for the rest of the match. And knowing the type of player Nepo is, we can already sort of to expect some very obscure lines and maybe some irregular openings. But in fact, it's Magnus in this match who decides to take that route. So instead of going for a traditional sort of Berlin here with the black pieces, which he has done previously in other matches, he goes for a somewhat mainline approach at the start, castles pawn to h3, which is an anti-martial move here by Nepo. The idea is that if you play the move pawn to c3, black will play the move pawn to d5 and we get a martial gambit, which is something people want to generally avoid unless they are very well prepared. So pawn to h3. You can still play the martial by playing the move bishop to b7 here, and after the move pawn to c3, play pawn to d5 here. This is a very interesting gambit, and we'll see that Magnus actually plays something very similar to this in the game. So in the game, he played the move knight to a5. A very obscure, offbeat, and a move I have seen played over the board once, but I don't really know much about it apart from that white scores extremely well in practice, and I know the first couple of moves of theory. The line continues knight takes e5, knight takes b3, pawn takes, bishop to b7, hitting the pawn. Pawn goes to d3, and black plays the move pawn to d5, immediately breaking open the center. Now, after pawn takes, queen takes, the best move for white is to play the move queen to f3 to offer an immediate trade of queens since black cannot avoid it any longer. Knight takes would also open up an attack on this bishop on e7. So bishop d6. And here white plays the best move, but it might be a hard move to find if you are not familiar with this, and it's the move king to f1. The idea is just to sidestep any ideas by black of playing rook e8 and the rook being undefended. Rook to b8, which is in fact the best move, and we're following perhaps some computer preparation here. Bishop d2, again quite good. And the key moment of the game came a bit later. So we see that Magnus has sacrificed a pawn in this line in order to get the two bishops and somewhat tie down white's queenside. It's very hard to move these queenside pawns. So he has some decent compensation here. So after rook c1, rook c8, knight e2, the knight went back, bishop e3, knight e7, and this is probably one of the key moments of the game where Nepo in the game went for bishop f4, which is perhaps slightly inaccurate. Instead, he should have favored knight g3, or just a variation where he's keeping a few more extra pieces on the board. For example, bishop takes, and if black tries to take advantage of these doubled pawns by trying to blockade on this f4 square, then we can drop our knight back now to e2 to try and defend it, and perhaps look at playing f4, king g2, king f3 with a decent position, because we can sort of hang on to our pawn structure a little bit better Whereas in the game, after the move bishop to f4, we see an extra pair of pieces come off the board, and now it makes it a little bit harder to defend. Both this square and also these pawns, they become a little bit weaker. So rook e1, knight to f5, pawn to c3. And the rest of the game, we see that Magnus slowly starts to build and add more pressure to White's position. Knight to e1. So quite a passive move, but we need to hang on to everything in our position here. And we see Black is putting some pressure. The knight threatening to come into these squares. White's piece is very passive, and now Black is looking to open up the b file for his rooks. The game continued, king e2, rook went across. And now because we can't push our pawn, that would allow the knight to hop in. So Magnus managed to win his pawn back. But it wasn't enough to win the game, because this a6 pawn is still relatively weak, and there's no easy way to attack any of White's weaknesses here. So knight c4, threatening knight e5. The game continued rook e7 and ended in a perpetual with knight to e5. So as expected, I thought that the first game would end in a draw, but it was quite a fighting draw, and it set up a good tone for the rest of the matches. So let's hop into the second game now. So the second match started with 1d4 and ended up in a Catalan, which is a very surprising opening choice from Magnus. Likewise from Nepo, I would have been expecting something like a Grunfeld, but instead he played the move pawn to d5, c4, e6, and we head towards a Catalan. One of the main lines with bishop e7, pawn takes, queen c2, and now the main line goes something like a6, and queen takes c4, b5 of course. Here bishop b7, this is very topical for both sides. White can also play the move pawn to a4 here, another main line. But instead Black plays the move pawn to b5, which is a line I have looked at before, and is a very interesting one at that, and it's gaining a lot of popularity nowadays, especially with the top players who have been incorporating it into the games every so often. So here the two main moves for White are pawn to a4 and knight to e5, but pawn to a4 is probably the more topical one at the moment, and this is the one where I would expect Nepo would have spent most of his time preparing and expecting his opponent to play. Pawn to a4, something would continue with, the line would continue with pawn to b4 here, and here after the move knight f to d2, which is sort of agreed upon that it's the best move for White, because it thoroughly brings this bishop into the game, but at the same time opens an attack on this pawn. Here Black has played all sorts of moves, pawn to b3, pawn to c6, and so on, but I think the best move is actually one Magnus himself has played against Ding Liren, and that is the move knight to d5. A lot of people are also taking this line up with the black side and experimenting with it themselves with quite a lot of success. So the line continues knight takes c4, c5, pawn takes, and here bishop to a6, a nice intermezzo move. Knight to e3 was the Ding Liren game, and Magnus continued knight d7, knight takes, pawn takes, c6, rook c8, pinning this pawn on the c file. Bishop to f4, the knight went to c5, opening up an attack on this pawn, and position becomes very, very sharp. After c7, queen d7, the game continued knight e2, and then Magnus went for g5 to try and pick up this pawn on c7. Pawn went to f6, and then rook takes on c7. We got a very, very unbalanced position, but one where I think Magnus is doing totally fine, and he also proved it by going on to convert in a nice style. But if we go back, instead of the move pawn to a4, in the game Magnus opted for the move knight to e5, which is a very interesting choice, and It's happened in both games of the match so far, where Magnus's team has opted for lines which are somewhat less popular and probably not the first choice of the engine, which is a very good idea at a higher level chess, because your opponent, who's probably using a lot of engine analysis, probably wouldn't have put a lot of focus into these moves. But from my understanding, after knight e5, I thought that queen takes d4 here was totally fine for black, and it's an idea you can play in these Catalan b5 lines to just sacrifice the exchange and go for a lot of compensation. So after the move queen takes d4, my knowledge is that there are a few lines here for white, but all leading to absolutely fine positions for black. For example, bishop takes rook is met by queen takes e5. And here, let's say bishop to f4. One possible line. We can continue with the move queen h5. Bishop goes to g2, and already black is seizing the initiative in this position with the move pawn to e5. Bishop to d2, and now I really like this move. It's a really cool move in this position, and that is the one where black plays knight to c6. So we're just putting this knight on pre, threatening to bring the knight into the game with knight to d4. And if bishop takes c6, we can follow up with knight g4. And after h4, we have a very nice bishop takes h4 sacrifice, completely opening up the king side. And this is something white needs to be careful of, these sort of king side attacks where black swings the queen across despite being a whole exchange down. So instead of the move bishop takes a8, other options might be queen to c3, queen takes queen, knight takes, and here I believe black is totally fine after a couple of moves, the main line being knight to d7, just attacking the knight. It looks a bit odd just leaving our rook on pre, but after bishop takes, knight takes, we're whole exchange down. Next move we will defend our pawn chain with the move pawn to a6 or bishop to d7, and if white tries to capture the pawn, then we have a double attack with the move bishop to d7. So we're hitting this knight as well as the bishop. If knight takes on c7, then bishop d6 here will pick up one of the pieces with an advantage for black. There's also one more interesting move here, which I don't believe has been played before, and that is the move knight to f7. But I'm sure it's in the analysis and notes of both players. Here black has a couple of options again. We can play the move pawn to c6. We can also play the move knight to d5. For example, pawn to c6, knight g5, knight a6. Game remains very sharp. Of course you can't take because of knight b4. And I think black is doing relatively okay here. Same goes for knight d5. Perhaps I like the c6 move a lot better, but knight d5 is objectively okay as well, but does require a lot more accurate play, I feel. After bishop takes g5, one sample variation might continue knight to d7 here, and after, let's say, pawn to a4, black could continue with queen to g4. This is a top recommendation of the engines as well. So queen takes e2, and we get some very forcing lines here. For example, knight to c3, knight takes, queen takes, and black has to play very accurately. For example, pawn to b4 in order to activate his rook on b8 with tempo. Queen takes, rook comes to b8, queen c3, rook comes into b3, and black is just about okay here, despite the fact that his pawn structure is quite bad. He has enough counterplay here to make up for that. So all in all, my understanding is that queen takes d4 is okay, but probably Magnus's team had something ready for that one. Instead, Nepo went for the move pawn to c6, which is similar to knight to d5 as well. So if knight takes here, we'll just take back followed by rook b8. So instead a4 was played. After a4, we have to play the move knight to d5. So this is a very common response in the Catalan to try and block this diagonal from the bishop. So we want to try and force white to play the move pawn to e4, after which we can reroute our knight safely and the bishop is blocked by the pawn. Knight c3 was played, and here Nepo plays the move pawn to f6. Also a fairly common idea to get rid of this knight. Knight went back to the f3 square. Could also go back to g4, but f3 seems a lot more natural. Queen d7, a very important move here in this position. Now, you have to understand that in this position, our ideal setup of pieces is going to involve most likely the bishop going to b7, the knight going to a6, and perhaps to b4. So we don't really want to play a move such as a6 right away, because we want to leave this square open for our knight. And then because we're not using the d7 square, the queen is quite useful on this square, defending e6 and at the same time supporting this b5 pawn. So pawn to e4, knight to b4 here. So e4 was quite a committal move by Magnus, but he decided to go for some concrete play there. Queen to e2. Also, I want to point out that there are some positions here which we sort of want to avoid as black. For example, black is holding off from taking this knight as long as he possibly can, and that's why he played queen d7. And I just want to point out that I've seen this move, knight takes c3, played a lot, followed by bishop b7, and this can run into a lot of tactics. For example, pawn takes, and knight g5, hitting this h7, and the bishop is under attack. So just watch out for this when you're playing this type of positions, not to take on c3 too early. Okay, so knight b4, the knight hops into the d3 square. Now white can try to get rid of this knight right away at some point with the move knight to e1. This is always an option, but first he decides to play the move pawn to e5, perhaps following up with knight e1 later on. Okay, so bishop b7 was played in this position because white was threatening some sort of captures, followed by opening the diagonal for the bishop. Here white went for pawn takes on f6. He could also perhaps consider some knight e1 moves in certain situations, but pawn takes is fine. Here of course we should go bishop takes f6. The game continued knight to e4, makes sense. So these positions can be very tough for black if he's unable to get in the move pawn to c5, and if white is able to blockade these e5 and c5 pawn breaks, then he can get some sort of bind, and it can be very unpleasant for black in the long term. The knight went to a6, and here Magnus played maybe the move knight to e5 a bit too quickly, and he might not have seen Nepo's response. Not completely sure if he missed it or not, but definitely from the looks of what Nepo was showing at the board, it definitely felt like Nepo himself thought that it was probably a slight mistake for white to go for knight e5 right away. Instead, maybe bishop e3 might have been a better option. Not entirely sure, but the game might have continued knight to b4, for example knight e5 here, pawn take, bishop takes, pawn takes, and now black can play the move pawn to c5. And there are some tactics now lined up on this diagonal with bishop takes g2. For example, pawn takes b5 might be followed by bishop to d5, just supporting these 2 pawns in the center, putting the bishop on this good square, and we can follow up with queen takes b5 or something along the lines next move. Instead, after the move knight to e5 right away on move 17, bishop takes, pawn takes, and now knight c5 is a little bit of an annoying move for white to face. For example, knight takes c5, knight takes c5 is not so good for white, because we just return our knight eventually to the d3 square, and then we play this move pawn to c5 eventually, which is the freeing pawn break for our position as black, after which we have no problems, especially if we're trading off light squared bishops as well. So instead, Magnus decided to sacrifice the exchange with knight d6, because after the move knight to b3, black is picking up one of either the rook or the bishop. There's two ways to sacrifice the exchange here. One is to move the bishop and sacrifice the rook in a corner. The other one is just to force black to take both knights off the board. And he went for rook b1. Knight takes, rook takes, knight takes, rook takes, and we reach this quite interesting position where if you put it into an engine, it will say that black is definitely better, maybe even significantly better, but it's not so easy in practice to convert this sort of advantage. It definitely feels like white has some decent compensation, especially on the dark squares here, but at the same time these pawns on the queen side can be quite dangerous, so white needs to keep an eye on these. So rook b8 was the starting move by Nepo, just to keep an eye on this bishop and maybe get some play going along this b file at some point, maybe looking to take this pawn. Rook to d1 and bishop to a8. This is sort of tempting white to take this pawn. So it's very tempting to take either this one or this one and get some sort of discovered attack on the queen, but after the simple sidestep to e7, we see that white hasn't really achieved anything, and the opening of the file in fact sort of helps black. For example, in this position we can play the move rook to b4, and black is looking to activate his pieces, especially his rooks along this open b file, and it can be quite dangerous for white, because if black starts to consolidate his position and gets pieces to good squares, then the advantage will become much larger. So queen e7, so that bishop e4. So here black played the move pawn to c3, so sacrificing the pawn. Perhaps his idea is that if white takes it, then at some point he wants to take here and create a passed a pawn. Queen c2, pawn to g6. But we start to feel some inaccurate moves here, slightly inaccurate moves from Ian, which sort of gives Magnus's some more chances here. So the open a file actually helps Magnus a bit more now, because he can put pressure along this on this a7 pawn. Pawn to c5, trying to trade off some pieces. Makes sense because the bishop is completely hemmed in. Queen c4, bishop takes, knight takes, and now I feel that it's getting a bit more dangerous for black, because there's no clear way to activate your pieces, and at the same time white has a lot of dangerous threats. Like the rook can come to a7, the knight can sort of hop into these squares. The pawn is weak, maybe the c pawn you have to keep an eye on, and we have to be careful here as black. At the same time, we don't have any clear plans of how we're going to use our extra material. King h8, knight d6, rook to b6, perhaps hinting at some sort of exchange sacrifice back. Rook to b8. Of course, if black can trade off a pair of rooks, that would be very beneficial. Pawn to a6, king to h3, rook to c6, queen d4, king back to g8, and now the c pawn starts pushing up the board. Queen c7. We can see here that black doesn't really have a plan. We're sort of sitting and waiting, and at some point the knight becomes too much of a problem, Nepo feels, so he decides to just sacrifice the exchange back. Queen takes d6, and we get a lot of simplification now. Queen c5, queen takes e6, king goes to g7, rook takes on a6. So here we see that black is a pawn down, but it's not easy at all for white to convert this into a win, especially after rook f8, pawn push, and queen f5. We get into basically a theoretically drawn ending because rook versus 2, rook versus 3 is a simple draw for these guys. And the game continued. Such, black is just cutting off the king from moving up the board. Rook e5. So the more pawn exchanges here, the more it favors black and makes it a little bit easier for him to draw. Pawn push. We have check from behind. We have exchange. Check. Rook goes across. Check. And we have a repetition here because white doesn't want to push the pawn because black will just throw in a check here on f4, picking it up anyway. So far we've had two really fighting chess, and we've had some very interesting games from both sides. The lines Magnus have chosen have been very interesting from his team, bringing some new and fresh ideas to the table, and they sort of give me some sort of Dubov vibes, especially this whole Catalan setup. So it's very interesting to see what they come up with for the following games. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you on the next recap.